Hello everyone, my name's Sarah. I'm with Hermes Exim Services. Today I'm going to talk about FCA, which is the second Incoterm in the spectrum. In FCA, the seller's responsibility is to provide the goods and the commercial invoice in conformity with the contract of sale and any other evidence of conformity that may be required by the contract. The buyer must pay the price of the goods as provided in the contract of sale. In FCA, the seller must deliver the goods to the carrier or another person nominated by the buyer at the named point. The seller must deliver the goods on the agreed date or at the time within the agreed period notified by the buyer, or if no such time is notified, then at the end of the agreed period. Delivery is completed when the goods have been loaded on the means of transport provided by the buyer if the named place is the seller's premises, or in any other case when the goods are placed at the disposal of the carrier or another person nominated by the buyer on the seller's means of transport ready for unloading. If no specific point has been notified by the buyer within the named place of delivery, and if there are several points available, the seller may select the point that best suits his purpose. In FCA, the seller bears all risks of loss of or damage to the goods until they have been delivered. The buyer bears all risks of loss of or damage to the goods from the time they have been delivered. If the buyer fails to nominate a carrier or another person or to give notice, or if the carrier or person nominated by the buyer fails to take charge of the goods, then the buyer bears all risks of loss of or damage to the goods from the agreed date, or in the absence of an agreed date from the time selected by the buyer, or if no such time has been notified from the end of any agreed period for delivery, provided that the goods have been clearly identified as the contract goods. The seller has no obligation to the buyer to make a contract of carriage. However, the seller must provide the buyer with any information or documents in possession of the seller, including transport-related security requirements that the buyer needs for arranging carriage. If agreed, the seller must make the contract of carriage at the buyer's risk and cost. The seller must comply with any transport-related security requirements up to the delivery. The buyer must contract or arrange at his own cost for the carriage of the goods from the named place of delivery, unless the contract of carriage is made by the seller. In FCA, the seller has no obligation to the buyer to make a contract of insurance. However, the seller must provide the buyer at the buyer's request risk and cost with information in the possession of the seller that the buyer needs for obtaining insurance. The buyer has no obligation to the seller to make a contract of insurance. The seller must provide the buyer at the seller's cost with the usual proof that the goods have been delivered. The seller must provide assistance to the buyer at the buyer's request, risk, and cost in obtaining a transport document, where the buyer has instructed the carrier to issue to the seller a transport document. The seller must provide any such document to the buyer. The buyer must accept the proof that the goods have been delivered. If the parties have so agreed, the buyer must instruct the carrier to issue to the seller at the buyer's cost and risk a transport document stating that the goods have been loaded, such as a bill of lading with an onboard notation. In FCA, where applicable, the seller must carry out and pay for all export clearance formalities required by the country of export, such as export license, security clearance for export, pre-shipment inspection, and any other official authorization. The seller must assist the buyer at the buyer's request, risk, and cost in obtaining any document or information related to all transit, import, clearance formalities, including security requirements and pre-shipment inspection needed by any country of transit or the country of import. Where applicable, the buyer must assist the seller at the seller's request, risk, and cost in obtaining any document or information related to all export clearance formalities, including security requirements and pre-shipment inspection needed by the country of export. Where applicable, the buyer must carry out and pay for all formalities required by any country of transit and the country of import, such as import license and any license required for transit, security clearance for import and any transit, pre-shipment inspection, and any other official authorization.
If you find this kind of videos helpful in your international career, give this video a like and remember to subscribe the channel so that you can see the later videos.
The seller must pay the costs of those checking operations, such as checking quality, measuring, weighing, and counting that are necessary for the purpose of delivering the goods. The seller must, at his own cost, package the goods unless it is usual for the particular trade to transport the type of goods sold unpackaged. The seller must package and mark the goods in the manner appropriate for their transport unless the parties have agreed on specific packaging or marking requirements. Trading under FCA, the seller must pay all costs relating to the goods until they have been delivered, other than those payable by the buyer. The seller must pay the costs of providing the usual proof to the buyer that the goods have been delivered. The seller must pay duties, taxes, and any other costs related to export clearance where applicable. The seller must pay the buyer for all costs and charges related to providing assistance in obtaining documents and information. The buyer must pay all costs relating to the goods from the time they have been delivered. The buyer must pay the seller for all costs and charges related to providing assistance in obtaining documents and information. The buyer must pay duties, taxes, and any other costs related to transit or import clearance where applicable. The buyer must also pay any additional costs incurred, either because the buyer fails to nominate a carrier or another person, or the carrier or person nominated by the buyer fails to take the goods into charge, provided that the goods have been clearly identified as the contract goods. Under FCA, the seller must give the buyer sufficient notice either that the goods have been delivered or that the carrier or another person nominated by the buyer has failed to take the goods within the time agreed. The buyer must notify the seller of the name of the carrier or another person nominated within sufficient time as to enable the seller to deliver the goods. The buyer must notify the seller of the selected time, if any, within the period agreed for delivery when the carrier or the person nominated will receive the goods. The buyer must notify the seller of the mode of transport to be used by the carrier or the person nominated, including transport-related security requirements. The buyer must also notify the seller of the point where the goods will be received within the named place of delivery.